The psychedelic revolution is here. If you want to integrate your visionary experiences into your purpose, get clear on your entrepreneurial path, and help people while you do what you love, then this podcast is for you. Welcome to The Psychedelic Entrepreneur, Medicine for These Times. I'm your host, Beth Weinstein. I'm a spiritual business coach, 3-time entrepreneur, and a lifelong student of psychedelics and sacred plant medicines. You carry your own unique medicine, and your medicine is what we need for these times. This podcast will help you to share your medicine so you can create transformation in the world. Listen in on conversations with psychedelic leaders, changemakers, and conscious entrepreneurs who are living proof that a better world is possible when you follow your heart and live in alignment with your soul. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Medicine for These Times. I am so honored to have Dr. Ido Cohen with us here today from the Bay Area, California, my hometown. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm excited to get into it. I have heard about your work for so long, and I've heard a lot of great things. I've heard you're absolutely smart to talk about, and it's really interesting right now in the psychedelic space, how quick things are changing. And I can't wait to hear your viewpoint on this, especially as an educator, kind of tied in with some of the big players out there in the industry. Even saying that word industry is always so weird to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Dr. Cohen serves individuals, couples, and groups in San Francisco. He received his PhD from the California Institute of Integral Studies and trained at the Young Institute in San Francisco. He works with a diverse range of challenges: childhood trauma, inner critics, relationship, intimacy challenges, lack of fulfillment, psychospiritual growth, as well as psychedelic integration and preparation sessions with individuals and group. His doctoral study researched the integration process of ayahuasca ceremonies while applying Jungian psychology to better understand how to support individuals in their process of change and transformation. He is currently finishing a study on the use of psychedelics in couples. He's the founder of the Integration Circle and facilitates workshops on the different dimensions of integration and the intersection of mental health, spiritual health, and the entheogenic experience. Ido also teaches with Psychedelics Today and is the resident integration facilitator for Double Blind magazine. He is passionate in supporting individuals to create long-term, sustainable change leading to intimate, authentic, expressive, and love-filled lives. In his free time, he likes to find new paths in nature with his dog Luna, marvel at art, write, create, and connect with his community. This is great. I can't wait to hear more about
It's so long. I'm sorry.
What was it?
It sounds so long.
So long?
It sounds so long.
Well, stop doing so much in the world, right?
I guess so, yeah.
No, please don't stop. I actually can't wait to hear about the ayahuasca research and also couples work, which has come up so much recently. Mm-hmm. But, the first question I always ask is about your own path. We were talking a little off camera. You grew up in Israel. You're out in the Bay Area now. You're a key player out in this psychedelics field. I'm curious, what brought you onto this path? Did you know you were going to be doing this when you were young? Like, what was your own journey with these?
That's a great place to start. What brought me? The short story would be this. I think I was always very curious. I'm very imaginative. I think like many people in the psychedelic world, from a very young age, I knew that there is something more. I explored it, and it came through my imagination and, doing stuff like playing Dungeons and Dragons and, being reading fantasy and slowly it kind of coagulated to being more starting to find that curiosity in spiritual traditions. And for me, it was very interesting because, I remember doing a paper on Greek gods when I was in 4th grade. Why would a 4th grader be? But it started going deeper when I was in the Army, actually. And I think it was being in that system really brought up a lot of questions for me about ethics and what it means to be human, and finding a meaning inside seeing all these really dysfunctional systems from being in them and really trying to find how is this, why is this happening, how is this real, what's the meaning, is there a meaning to all of this? And I started really reading a lot about Buddhism, and my first go-to was through Buddhism and Hinduism, actually. And reading, and I started practicing yoga and meditating in the army, which then, I mean, we're talking 27 years ago or something like that in Israel, which was not very common still. And I went to, after the army, like many Israelis do, you either travel to South America or you go to Southeast Asia. And I went to India for a year. And I had a handful of psychedelic experiences till then. They were mostly MDMA, and it was either in a party scenario or hanging out with people. But they always took me to a very deep, like self-inquiry. So people were having a lot of time, and I was analyzing the situations and just feeling myself and feeling people interaction. And I even thought there was something off, because like these people are partying like and dancing, and I'm here like feeling all these things. And um and then obviously being in India opened my spirituality to a whole other place, and it was the first time I tried LSD. And that was when things got very real. Being in a place that already feels so profoundly spiritual on levels that I didn't even know, giving me the space to integrate my army experience, ask all these questions that 21-year-olds I think should ask, which is, who am I? What am I doing? Where do I want to go? What is my dream? What do I want to do? What is my offering to this world? How do I want to be of service? And then taking LSD and seeing all these other dimensions of existence, and having some kind of being in India gave me a little bit of spiritual framework to start understanding what I was experiencing on LSD. And I was like, oh, this is what it means to see beyond illusion. The idea of life and death working together, but not just intellectually understanding it, but really kind of embodying it, feeling it, and seeing how it's also a symbolic process, that we kind of change always. We die and we rebirth. So when I came back, I was really inspired. I knew I wanted to be a therapist when I was a teenager, so that was obvious to me that that's my path. But when I came back, I remember making a vow to myself that I will study change. I didn't know what integration meant then. And what I wanted to do is, because I had the fortune of traveling with a bunch of my good friends, and I met a person in India. We fell in love. We became partners. And when we came back, we were luminous beings there. Not that we didn't struggle. There was eruptions of implicit memories of sexual abuse for friends of mine, or depression, and just struggling with existential, like wondering, like, what the fuck am I here to do? And we started, we were sitting, there's not much to do there at night, because so you kind of sit like around a fire and you talk and you tell stories and you laugh and you joke. And we started talking about childhood and our problems, so conversation we wouldn't really have to that depth. And when we came back, I just saw everybody's process collapse. We all came back and became, I'm lucky because I was deeply in love, and my partner at the time was as crazy as I was. So we helped each other stay on that frequency of honoring the sacred and exploration and curiosity and meditating in the morning and really kind of living, right, trying to integrate. But for a lot of my friends, everything kind of fell apart. They started getting depressed. They started feeling the pressure of like, okay, that was fun. That was just like a really good dream that we lived for a while. Now we need to get real, and we need to get serious, and we need to go find a job. And I couldn't make sense of it. I really struggled. I'm like, how is it possible that only a month ago we were sitting looking into this beautiful view and really feeling connected to life, and feeling people connected to their authenticity, and having vulnerable, deep, meaningful conversations, and everything fell away. It really didn't make sense to me. And I was really, really possessed by that question. And I was like, I'm going to study this one day. I have to. Fast forward 10 years, I came to the US. I wanted to study something that blends psychology and spirituality. I did my undergrad in psychology and sociology. And it was clear to me that the only way to treat people is to see all their dimensions, the somatic, the emotional, the psychic, and the spiritual. And I only found it in transpersonal psychology and Jungian psychology, which was, again, not very developed at the time in Israel. So this was 21 years ago. And I started doing research, and through a synchronistic story, I found California Institute of Integral Studies. I came here, and 6 months into my being here, I met someone who introduced me to, we had a really powerful conversation. We felt a very strong soulful kinship. And I was telling her about my interest in trying mescaline. I never did that. I wanted to do a peyote ceremony. You know, I was influenced by Carlos Castaneda and all the books. And within 2 months, she came back to me and she's like, well, I have an invitation for you, but it's not what you want. She's like, there's this very famous, renowned 70-year-old shaman from Peru who's coming around. My friends are hosting him, and he serves ayahuasca. And I was like, didn't know much about it. And both, I think mostly luck and some kind of divine protection. I went into it incredibly naive. I was like a child in the cosmic playground. I was like, oh, I'm going to be a researcher, and I'm going to sit here and like observe. And you know, I remember everybody comes up one by one and they drink, and then they turn the lights off, and he starts singing, like, and it began as a whisper, and my field of vision became totally dark. I saw nothing. And all of a sudden reality dawned on me. I was like, oh, I don't think I thought this through. I'm not sure I really realized what I'm signing up for. And I had a profound experience. It really kind of disintegrated me. I remember struggling and seeing all my personalities. You know, I talk about it's like Salvador Dali's clocks. Like everything I tried to grasp on just melted. And I'm talking anything. I tried to pray, the prayer just melted away. And I felt like I was just falling and falling and falling. And I was panicked. I was really panicked. And I heard this voice say, okay, obviously you're not ready to let it all go. You get to choose one thing. What do you want? And my instinct was, took me years to understand why, but it just came out of me. I was like, my sanity. And then there was this silence, and the next thing that happened, I remember, is that I was in this blissful void. And I felt someone behind me, like almost like putting their hand on my back. And it was just blissful peace. Like, what do you hope for? What do you hope to get into meditation? And it went from that, and then I would be thrusted into feeling all my personalities at the same time. So if you think about the second movie in The Matrix, where he sees all his personalities on the screen, so feeling all, and then being kind of thrusted in and out of those two states for God knows how long. And then it opened up to having intuitions about my family and seeing my parents' woundings and how I should treat them, and seeing a whole bunch of things, and seeing what at some point I was looking at. There was a man and a woman who were singing at the same time, and I saw the energetic lines that they were drawing in the room and what they're actually doing, having my mind blown. And when I came out of that, I was sat with that one for a long time. I was like, that is totally out of my framework. I can start piecing it together. But when it was time to choose my dissertation study, I was like, oh, I know what I'm doing. I wanted to study change. And I had this profound experience that is a catalyst for change. I'm going to put them together. So I studied the integration process of ayahuasca ceremonies from a psycho-spiritual lens. So that's the short story.
I love this because that's actually it's a very similar story to my first ayahuasca experience. I had been on other spiritual paths for most of my life, and worked with other psychedelics, mostly recreational. Some a little more intentional, maybe some mushrooms. But when I went into ayahuasca, it was I went in with the intent that I was just going to do it once. And I was really, I was in a very good place where I was meditating every day and just in a solid place, but very transitional time in my life. And I went in kind of just full on, like, yeah, curious, not knowing what to expect, like hearing some stories, but really not knowing at all what I was getting into. And also sat with an amazing Peruvian shaman who to this day I still sometimes work with, who's been pouring medicine for 35, 40 years. I mean, he's a master, but oh my God, that integration took me over a year. And honestly, for someone who is pretty stable, what it showed me, it was hard to make sense out of it. It's like, oh, now I understand what they mean by the illusion. Because now I actually, stepped. But when you're a human being and you come back from that, I mean, my first thought was like, why am I even working? What's the point of this all? Like, I really was like, I kept saying, I was like, well, what's the point? Like, why am I even here? Like, fuck this, And it was really actually challenging. And this, of course, this is a while ago, long before the word integration was woven into, back then we didn't even have an integration circle.
No.
There's no such thing.
No.
It's like, see ya, call if you're, it was like kind of like call if you're okay or not okay. And I actually had to reach out to someone. I was like, who can I talk to about this? Like, I don't even know anyone who's doing this. So I love that story. And I actually would like to hear a little bit about, what you learned and what you've come up with through your dissertation, because I have had clients who do integration work, and some specialize in, let's say, ayahuasca, and some it's kind of this general like psychedelic integration. But, if someone's working with, let's say, MDMA, which they're categorizing as a psychedelic, which I don't think is necessarily a traditional, psychedelic. It's a very different experience than going on a dieta in Peru and coming back and your whole life is rocked.
Absolutely. I agree. I remember when I came out of that, I think I'm still integrating that one. There was an integration. When I started studying this, and not to toot my horn, there was no studies. I even remember meeting Stan Groff. So he was doing a holotropic breathwork weekend at CIS, and I was working at the cafe, and he was all alone, sitting, eating his whatever. And I was like, I have to ask him about integration. And I, mustered the courage, and I'm like, hey, Mr. Groff, I'm just like an admirer of your work. And I told him what I'm doing, and I asked him about integration. And his response was so interesting. He said, we make food for people. And I was like, what? What is he talking about? He's like, yeah, we found that when you feed people foods that are familiar to them right after a session, it triggers a certain reaction. So it actually brings them down and allows them to be more present with what we just did. And I was like, oh, interesting. And that opened the game for me. I was like, okay, this is a lot. But there was nothing. There was like chapters in books, but there was no actual research on what integration looks like, what is an integration framework. What do we even mean when we talk about that? I remember when I started, I looked at the dictionary of the APA, the American Psychological Association. The word integration doesn't exist. It's not in the APA, which says a lot about, right? I'm very much in agreement with you. I think integration is very different per person and per substance. And by substance, I mean chemical or organic. Because you're right, coming back from an MDMA experience is not the same as coming back from a month in the jungle, or 3 months or 6 months, where you are communing with plant intelligences that are not just metaphors, that are actual energetic beings that you have learning from, engaging with, confronted by, let alone all the other stuff in the jungle that, you explore. The energies of the plants that are not the ones you drink, right? The animals, the lifestyle of, and I think that's something integrators or integration facilitators should take into consideration, right? I think a lot of the problems when I teach archetypes, for example, for most facilitators, that's like a intellectual concept. And that's a misunderstanding of the actual Jungian framework. When we said archetypes are actual living intelligences with an emotional effects, meaning they impact you through your emotions. That's the first cue. Well, what can happen is that facilitators actually literalize or strip away the true psychospiritual realness of people's experience, and that's a problem, right? And again, I don't want to diss psychedelic, like non-organic psychedelics, but when you go to chemicals, I don't know if chemicals have an intelligence in them. They can open us up to those realms, absolutely, right? They can open us up to the transpersonal, archetypal, spiritual, shamanic realms. But as a substance, I don't think they have an entity in them. So it's a totally different thing.
I've actually gotten into that discussion with numerous people, because I tend to, veer towards the plant spirits more than others, although I have an appreciation and everything has their place. But, I talked to someone recently about this notion of like the spirit of ketamine. And I was like, I mean, if we all believe that God is all, right, maybe everything does have a spirit. Right. It's like the argument over is AI. It's an artificial intelligence. Well, I don't know. It's an intelligence. It's here. It's part of our reality. Who knows? There is no right or wrong.
Everything comes from creation.
Yeah.
Right. But there's levels of creation, right? Yeah. So as humans, we have a individual spirit that lives inside of us that is part of creation. Plants are the same thing in my mind. They are they are an independent intelligence that is part of creations. Ketamine, I don't know. I can't speak for that. I didn't feel it. I didn't feel it as profoundly. And maybe that's just me. Maybe we're just plant people, what they call it. But I think that's to come back to your question. I think so. That's one thing to take into consideration. And so there is the 3 stages. You prepare, you journey, there's the integration. But integration actually starts in the beginning, right? In the moment you enter into that agreement, into that intentionality. Because for me, that's when the experience starts talking to you. I've done integration. I've done people who have been fortunate enough and they saw the importance, and we did preparation of anywhere between 3 to 8 sessions. When they came back, they were like, actually, I could have worked with what we discovered without the substance. I had so much material. So that's one. 2, they said that journeying has been so much easier for them. They were like, there was very little that surprised me because all my stuff, we kind of touched on what I thought will come up. I kind of started preparing my body, my spirit to breathing in a different way, to orienting, to grounding. So it wasn't like a deer in the headlight. It wasn't like this overwhelming experience that came out of nowhere. And they had this already they started weaving this thread. So for me, integration starts in the beginning. It's how do you enter? With what do you enter? How do you navigate the space when it comes? And then there is stuff that I don't know if we will have time, but I always think about integration as, there are all those studies about the 0-4 weeks of where your neurocognitivity is like you're more flexible, right? We call it the sparkle period. And that's the first gate. That's the first gate of integration is how do you enter the first gate, right? Do you come back and you okay, the metaphor for me is about you went on a really, really good first date and now you're so excited about this new lover. Do you spend time thinking about them? Are you writing them love letters? Meaning, are you staying in connection? Do you send them text? What is the relationship like when you just return? Right? I think for a lot of us, it can be very inspiring or very deflating. So we don't really engage with it. We either just bask in the glory of it, which is great and good, and you should do it. Or we feel so devastated and deflated by it that we want nothing to do with it. And we're kind of just collecting the pieces. Both are very valid and say, okay, but how is that informing the beginning of your relationship? Because whatever you had is an experience. And then after that 4 weeks started, and you kind of most of us start doubting or we start negotiating with the process. Well, was it that powerful? Was it that spiritual? Was what I saw real or not real? And That's right. That's our psyche's way of staying in homeostasis, functional homeostasis, right? That psyche wants to integrate, but not too much. Not that it overwhelms the system, because then we have to start sacrificing, and there's disintegration and a lot of discomfort and change and grappling, and right, I see that this, and that's, for me, that's the crucial point. It's after the first month. It's like, okay, now the true measure of your relationship starts really playing out. How do you stay connected? How do you prioritize this in a world that is trying to fight for your attention and your time every single moment, trying to grab your consciousness? How do you prioritize that? How do you start taking insight and slowly weaving it into small little actions? What happens to you if your process is really that disintegrative? Can you stay in having a bigger process that you have no control over? And what you do have control is, I can go and talk to Beth once every week. I can go an integration circle. I can go walk in the woods, but not just go walk in the woods, and be on your phone, but like, I take all my experience, my discomfort, the beauty, whatever it is, I go and, right? So that's when the really next level integration starts. And from my experience, and it's been 12 years now of doing groups and individuals, and for me, that's the only way to create true long-term sustainable change. We can have sparks of catharsis, right? And like small, but to really create long-term sustainable change takes a long time. And it takes a certain level of devotion to your process.
Yes. And it's funny because I talk about this all the time, that to me, integration, I mean, if you're one of these people like maybe me, who work with medicines on a, what some might call regular, a few times a year, it's never ended.
Never.
I don't really believe there is a day where it's like, oh, I've had enough circles or enough support or enough deepening into, looking at the patterns and the thing, the tiny little shifts I want to make. But it's interesting when you mention that one mark, like after the month, because, some of us in this industry have kind of make fun of this and make jokes about the amount of people not doing integration work that then maybe go back to another ceremony or take more bufo or move to combo or go on a different retreat, or maybe they do some other peak experience. And we see this a lot where it's kind of like constant chasing. And they think they're doing the integration because maybe they, waited 4 weeks, or maybe it's a different medicine. So it's just mushrooms, it's fine. It's been a month. But it's interesting because I've been noticing this as I've just been, around various medicine communities and out in this space, that there's so much of this happening out there. And I keep wondering, like, are people valuing integration yet? Like, is this just a buzzword, or are there people that are like, oh, I'm integrating, I'm just moving to a next medicine? Like, I'm curious, what
for
are your
me,
views on
integration is I said it recently in Double Blind Summit. Integration is still the neglected child of psychedelics. That's my truth.
So true.
We are for many good reasons, we're very invested in legalization and what do we need to do to legalize, and right, how do we perfect and the actual experiences, if it's at-home ketamine or MDMA in clinical settings or whatever that is. And integration is the neglected child because integration really poses really very difficult questions. Because integration rebels against two main things for me, which is the combination of capitalism and suffering. We all want, right? Capitalism offers us fast change. Go at home, take 6 lozenges, journal about it, boom, no more depression that you've been, crippled with by 40 years. And I'm saying this not to make fun, because there is a lot that's good in ketamine, but I've seen how companies offer it, and I think that's really, really misleading.
Yeah.
The amount of cases that resolve prolonged depression in single sessions or 3 are so rare, and nobody tested them yet over a long time, right? We're just the big.
I keep meeting more and more people that are now doing ketamine therapy every week. And I'm like, wow, That's not
Great. I don't know what that means. I'm not okay. And what would be let's see the results in 2 to 5 years. Are you actually better? Right? Symptom reduction is great, but it will only take you as far. And for some of us, that's what we need. If you've been, suffering from chronic pain, chronic anxiety, chronic depression, or symptoms of PTSD all your life, and all of a sudden you get 3 weeks when you're without it, it's really important, right? But the idea is that capitalism is, right, the way capitalism infiltrated psychedelics is by offering, we talked about it right, panaceas. And it's the answer to our human suffering, to our human condition. So it's so tempting. Let me go do another dieta. I've seen people sign up to the craziest entheogenic experiences, really, from that place. And then they come and they have profound, a mystical experience. 3 weeks later, they come back because their addiction is worse. They are actually more depressed. They are fighting more with their partners. Nothing. It's actually more disintegrating than integrating. So how do we, right? For me, the question for us is, how do we all, facilitators, providers, participants, because we're all participants too, come together to build the education necessary to explain to all of us why the after process is so important? And it's not like going to the gym. And I revolt against those metaphors. It's not about that. It's like going to your village that we lost. It's going to the places where you get to have true connection with yourself and with others. Right? It's not just building another muscle. It's not for looks. It's not just, what do they call it? Spiritual hygiene. Yeah, that spiritual hygiene is great. But what about spiritual wealth? What about spiritual health? What about spiritual wellness? What about spiritual sharing and psycho-spiritual health together as a communal? So I think that's one. And then there is also the question of, how do we make this accessible? We have to talk about accessibility. And I'm actually curious to what you think, because I was on a panel for Double Blind and we were talking about what it takes to be an ethical facilitator. And when we got to money, the conversation became really tricky. And people said, and I said, it's because there are so many voices of oh, how do you, doesn't make it accessible to people, and there is a lot of gatekeeping because of money. And I'm like, absolutely. And we all need to eat. We all need to right? So I've been thinking a lot about what are the psychological hangups in the psychedelic world around reciprocity and money and accessibility.
Huge. It's a huge
Please.
topic. And I've talked very publicly about it because, my viewpoint and the way I teach my clients is to bring, first of all, everything has to be centered around your own personal values. Let's be honest. Some people are out there charging $40,000 for a psychedelic session with a medicine that they won't even disclose what the ingredients are. Maybe you know who I'm talking about. And then some people undercharge and are barely getting by. I have worked with many of them. And, the way I've been teaching people and, to each their own is to try to, center it around your value systems and bring it into a balance. I do believe, especially here in the United States, we're in this world of, there are people with lots of money and then there's people who don't have the money. And most of the facilitators I know serve, a range of people that can afford this, that have no problem paying whatever it is, $5,000, or going on a retreat that costs $7,000 with all the flights and everything. And then some people are really suffering and it's like $200 is tough. So maybe there's a way to set up a scholarship. Maybe there's a way to, do different tiered pricing, which I've seen being done more lately. I have seen that scholarship funds, people offsetting or at least offering, would you be willing to purchase 2 spots so we can gift this to someone else in need?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But, here's the thing too. I've also, something that's come up a lot lately are facilitators. I don't know, maybe it's just being in the position I'm in, is I'm seeing more and more because of the supply being more available, it seems that there's more facilitators like losing some business. So now they're getting a little more hungry for like,
Mm-hmm.
how do I make more money? And I need to
Yep.
sustain this. And, if you're doing private work, I mean, it's a lot. It's a day, sometimes more than a day. And it's, and this whole thing with like the ketamine world and now the psilocybin world trying to like scale these into,
Right.
a viable business. And it's not really scalable, or maybe it is if you want to host large groups of 50 and see what happens. But I mean, it's been hard to navigate. And I always wonder if it's,
Mm-hmm.
if it's partially because of the legalization and lack of decriminalization. I don't know. Or, the supply and demand. I mean, there's talks of, I've had this argument over, there's certain people that only want to work with someone who's highly trained or even licensed or skilled. And there's still few in the grand scheme of things. Most people are, self-taught or maybe apprentices. Yeah. And then there's, as we know, there's a lot of unskilled facilitators out there. But if someone's really desperate and it's all they can afford, I don't know. This is where we get into then there's harm being created. And, I've had this argument. It's who's to say what's right or wrong? Like, I don't know, 500 years ago, did we need someone licensed to hold space and sit with someone doing mushrooms? I don't know. No, but then again, I would never sit with someone unskilled ever, like myself, because I have, and it was a terrible experience,
Mm. No, I hear you. I think that's on a meta integration level, that's what this whole world is trying to integrate. It's all these incredible, profound questions you're asking. And no, 500 years ago, we didn't need someone with a license, but we also didn't have the same neurotic issues we have now, right? That requires certain tools and certain maps and of consciousness. But I think I love what you're saying, Beth, because for me, it's part of this conversation we were having, which is there is a shadow to money. And to be an ethical entrepreneur in this world, you have to really monitor your relationship with money constantly. I'm sure we can both share horror stories about individuals, who are absolutely undertrained, creating spaces they're not qualified to hold and charging obscene amount of money. And it comes from, and I think this is where there is such a learning for us to do, which is how much of this is coming from my own relationship with scarcity? How much of it is coming from the energy of greed, which is really powerful, right? If I see a community of people who are willing to pay me $10,000 for a psilocybin session, why wouldn't I? I heard people say, why wouldn't I charge them? They can pay. And because I have a whole list of reasons why you shouldn't charge that. And the big one for me, and this is where it's still, we're not having enough conversations, is how is your personal philosophy perpetuating systems of oppression and systems of inequality? If we're all going to psychedelics and being like, oh, we saw unity and how we need to care, and then I go and, maintain the systems that are opposite to that, where's my personal integration in this?
Yes. And I think that's been interesting to watch because I feel like, I have witnessed some of this where it's, there's a dissonance there. There's exactly. the vision. I mean, even honestly, even talking, I interviewed Rick Doblin at Burning Man out of all places this year. And he said one thing and I'm like, yeah, that's it is, there's, especially in this world that we're in now, there's a lot of like policing and telling everybody what's right or wrong or how things should be done. And in the end, I do believe in the larger picture of like, okay, there are a lot of people searching for help and healing, and a lot of people don't know where to turn. There is a huge amount of inaccessibility. And, maybe it is okay that guy who's had zero training, that gets his hands on some mushrooms and maybe read some books and had 20 of his own experiences, but he's charging, his friend a few $100s to help. I mean, I don't know who's to say that's right or wrong. I mean, there's people that are like, no one should be doing this unless they go through a $10,000 training program,
right?
Or 3-year training program or $30,000. And of course there's issues with those too, and so there's this constant questions of, how do we get this right? And how do we really show up for the larger vision of like, well, what do we all see? We see, like a whole, hopefully, more healing, more people living in joy. And which I believe, it's the systems are the root of most of the problems, right? But it's all interconnected.
Yes.
It's like the depths of people's suffering. And this is something I've talked about for years, which, I help people start and grow their businesses, but people say they're depressed. And it's like, well, you're depressed because you're in a system, working some job that you absolutely hate because you feel like you have to, because you're stuck in the system. But, it's like, so then how do we get to the root of it?
Exactly.
And that's where there's this catch-22, right? It's like, well, you need the money to get out of it. And so, establishing values, but I also think there's something maybe within, and this is where I wonder if this was completely decriminalized in every aspect, I don't even like to use the word legalization because there's a lot of issues coming along with that, which I've already seen. But if it was just, kind of a free-for-all, I don't know. How would things be different? Maybe it would be a little easier. Maybe it would be more accessible. I don't know.
There's so many good conversations just in what you said right now. I remember having this talk with a friend of mine, Joe Tafour, you probably know.
Yeah.
And we were talking about it in one of our consultation groups. We invited him to give a talk, and we brought some of these questions up, participants, and he said something. He's like, listen, harm is inevitable. Yeah. People are going to get harmed. And there was something really uncomfortable about that answer because it's true. Yeah. Right? So, and I said to him after, because I was fighting that truth. And I said, okay, Joe, but how many people? Yeah. When is it enough? Mm-hmm. When do we need to say like, hey, too many people have been harmed? And I think that's where we don't have the answers yet, right? Mm-hmm. What is a harm reduction model for this movement? Right. I am with you. Do we need to have this accessible? Sure. Does everybody need to be licensed? Absolutely not. And can we all be in some kind of integrity to say, hey, if I set for my friend and all of a sudden they had implicit sexual trauma come up, can I be in integrity and say, you know what? I think you need to go talk to a professional. This is way out of my scope. And that's where I feel like we're having something we still have a lot of learning to do. I think a lot of people are mesmerized by the revelations in their sessions, and they're like, oh, I'll take this on. I get, this is why I'm fortunate. I'm in California. We have a big network here, and I get messages I just got a message today from someone. It's like, listen, I sat with this man who was in my circle that I facilitated. He is sending me relentless texts and emails about him being in love with me. He will not let it go. Mm. What do I do? So it's even on that level, right? Yeah. How do you deal with erotic transference? How do you deal with that? And we've seen just a recent, right?
Don't even get me started on transference.
Exactly. Right. And we've seen many times, right? Not even just a few months ago, about very experienced professionals falling in the trap of that energy, and then harm is done. So there is that integrity piece, right? Of how do we keep each other in integrity? How do we do that as a community?
That right there. Yeah, it's interesting. I was just telling someone, God, what day is today? It was over the weekend. I was like, I don't know why the last few months I've had so many people coming to me with horror stories. I don't know why maybe it's just the position I'm in, but it's like, it's getting more and more. And, and there's names attached to them. And, it's good to know because, hey, like, at least like pure accountability. I'm not referring anybody there, or I need to have a talk with someone, even someone who I trusted, it's like, okay, now I have to have a hard talk. Like, hey, what happened? And, it's one out of many people, but still it's, and I think that's it, is having this education, these discussions. Yes. But it is getting eye-opening. And I've been saying this for years, and because I had a personal experience with some transference with my former partner, who was a therapist, who ended up with one of his clients. And that was like an utter moment for me where I was like, wait, what is the boundary with this? Now I need to understand on a deeper level, like, what are the rules? And it was so, I will actually send you a screenshot of this post. It was fascinating to see how, when I posed the question, how long can a therapist go out with a client? Like, how long after they're, in a therapeutic relationship? And I must have had like 300 responses to this Facebook post. And it was amazing to see how extreme it was. It's like a lot of people, well, they're adults, let them do what they want. And this is like no MDMA involved. This is like just regular therapy. And I've said this, I said, well, I think we're probably going to have to go through some hard times. We're going to hear a lot of horror stories. Unfortunately, there's going to be scapegoats, and, it's kind of like you said, how many is it going to take? I said, there's probably going to be that day where the horror story is going to make the international news, and we've already gotten some of that. But I think education, discernment, like people really doing their own due diligence. And I mean, I know I've had my own personal experiences where wish I had listened to myself more, like, okay, that was a bad experience. Now I'm never going back and never referring that person. And I hope they don't come around here anymore. Right. But it's a weird world, the way I teach people. And this is, again, I think this is where it's like pure accountability. And I keep saying, I know the Sacred Plant Alliance, I think, is doing this, where I think their model would be great if it could be taken out in a larger scale. I don't know how that would be possible, but just to have these conversations and, not to point fingers at like, oh, I didn't like what this one person did. Now I'm going to ruin their whole career. Yes. I don't believe in canceling, but, holding someone accountable and having hard conversations, which I have found in the psychedelic space, not a lot of people are willing to have hard conversations, because I'm not even doing this kind of work. And I've had people cancel me just because they didn't like one thing I said. And it's like, oh my God. But this is where there's I agree. Like lack of integration, right?
Absolutely. For me, 99% of any psychological splitting is, based on some kind of level of, wait, you're having a hard time with processing multiple emotions at the same time. So the best thing is to cancel the other person, or to cancel the issue, or to cancel the thing, right? We're seeing that a lot right now. Yeah. I agree with you. I think there a lot of people in this space have a confusion between accountability and shaming, because I think there is a lot of shaming in the psychedelic world, which is like, well, this person made a mistake, let's tear them to shreds and make a scapegoat out of them, as opposed to like, wait, in reparative justice, in, Ho'oponopono, in all these traditions, what you do is you make it really vulnerable for everybody. And we bring this as, yes, this person has an issue. And how do we all learn from this? Because this exists in all of us. We can all make that mistake. Yes. And how do we've had just as it's a very common comebacks to money. We had someone in our consultation group who was starting telling us stories about how they're doing 3, 4, 5 active sessions per week. And we were all like, and then there was somebody, we're like, hey, someone really mirrored that to them. It's like, hey, it sounds like you're doing a lot. And you're also telling us that you're really exhausted all the time. How are you integrating between sessions? And it turned a light bulb to this person. And she felt ashamed at the beginning. She was like, oh my God, I can't believe, like, how did I not see this? But because we were really in an environment of like, wait, it's okay. Let's talk about the shadow of money. Let's talk about feeling so inspired by the medicine that you just want people to experience it, right? That's another thing. Yeah. And this person did a beautiful piece of work with himself. And she actually canceled an entire month. And she's like, I'm taking this month to rest and really reflect about what's right relationship for me with this offering. And she made a rule for herself to not offer more than 2 sessions per week. That's it. And 2 is like, because there is something that really feels calling. She's like, I understand what my pace is now. And for me, that was a really full process. And I think that could be a good example. It's like, wait, it is psychedelic, right? Okay, just because someone is flooding all this shadow that we all need to deal with, how about we all take a moment? How do we all learn from each other as opposed to needing to make the same mistakes over and over to learn for ourselves?
Yes. And just cancel. Actually, if you can spearhead a group, I'd be happy to start helping you with it. Because, I have to say, I interviewed someone extremely well known out there who a few years ago had a very big public, scandal surface. And I had interviewed her, and the interview was supposed to go live literally like 2 days after this scandal broke. And I turned to some peers in this industry who I trust, who get it. And I said, I'd kind of like to publish this interview. And they all were like, no, you can never publish that interview. And I was like, well, now I actually want to go back and talk to her. I haven't heard from her since that happened. But, I kept saying, I was like, isn't there an opportunity here for all of us versus just cutting her out and but it's been interesting to watch because I've now seen this happen to a lot of people. And at the same time, it's like, well, how do we hear both sides of the story? How do we learn from it? How do we hear, I don't really believe that it's always one person too. I mean, yeah, like if there's a true facilitator and there's true abuse, but there's always these two sides. And
but Beth, you're advocating for psycho-emotional complexity, right? For people,
that's too hard.
It's for a lot of people, it's a luxury, right? They're surviving. And for most of us, it is too hard, and I love what you're advocating for, because for me, that's one of the pillars of psychedelic integration. If you can't in yourself be a vessel for opposing messages, your integration process is going to be really challenging, right? Because you were one person, you had a psychedelic experiences, boof, you discovered a whole bunch of new things. You come out, it's old versus new. That's the first thing you're meeting. So I love what you're advocating for. I mean, yeah, that when Cover Story came up, I'm assuming that's maybe, I don't know if you're right? That was such a big wave for the whole community. And we can talk about the aftermath and the ripple effects of all of it. But there is still so much we can learn from it that we haven't, because it was so complex for all of us to carry. Like, what do you mean by this person has done so good for so many people, and now they're the devil, and should we give this person a platform? What do you mean? Don't give them a platform, like they're the devil now, right? Yeah. We don't want to hear that. And right, it brings all these deep ethical questions. Do you believe survivors? Can you question survivors? Is there room for multiple truths at the same time? And, God forbid, don't talk about it because you're risking legalization.
Yeah. That's also because this has come up even for me. It's like, okay, if I've now had a few people mention some names of people who I personally know, it's like, okay, how do we handle this, and what is it now? I just never platform them again, or never send anybody there again, or, and it's like, I don't know. I mean, eventually you're going to hear a horror story about everybody. I mean, because we're all human. Like even my own therapist, who I've been working with for years, who I think is an amazing human being. I've seen her. Like we all have ego. There's ego.
Absolutely.
But it's been interesting to watch because it's just so. And then everybody gets, everybody's on eggshells. Everybody's afraid to really be their fullest self, and because it comes back to the system. There's a lot of scarcity of like, well, if I then, let that interview go live, then I might get canceled for letting that interview go live. So then there goes my business. I mean, I've struggled with that too, where it's like,
absolutely.
Oh, people don't like the viewpoints of this one person, but I actually find them really curious. And it's like, am I going to get canceled now? I mean, it's crazy. But this is where it's been interesting to watch, like how many people are really doing the true integration. And like you said, like what is real integration, and is it integration to only our comfort level? And then
exactly. I mean, for me, what you're talking about is part of integration on the meta and personal level, which is what's your relationship with authenticity and loss, right? If it's in my authenticity to release that podcast, am I willing to tolerate the potential loss for my authenticity? Right? It's not that different. I mean, it is different, but not that different. Then I come out of a ceremony, I sit and I'm like, you know what? This marriage that I've been in, not the marriage I want to be in anymore. That's my authenticity. But to blow up that marriage means I'm sending myself on a different life trajectory. Am I willing to carry that loss in the name of rebirth of authenticity? And it's such a hard question. We talked about this in the summit because we were talking, someone in our trio said, I've never heard a conference where there was a talk about money. There's never been a conference where there was a segment that just talked about money.
They missed mine. No, I'm kidding.
Right? But yeah. It's like, and why? Because it's a symptom. It's a symptom of the things we don't want to deal with. But those things, right? But like, we know this. It's like Psychology 101. Anything that you repress or oppress is in control.
It's been very interesting. It's come up so much. People will have behind the scenes conversations around money, but out in public, I mean, it's very fascinating how many people within this industry have talked to me about their money, their situation, their programs. But then in public, it's a whole different story. It's like, oh, well, and
why do you think, other than being canceled, what do you think people are? That's the reason? Okay.
I mean, it's been funny where I'm like, I don't really care because I actually equate it to being up there with the taboo of talking about sex. I mean, it's like part of our life. Unfortunately, it's like, yeah, I don't really love the way the whole system is set up. And I do believe one day it will have to change because it's totally not sustainable. Like, let's acknowledge that. There's something with, it's capitalism is here though. And what the term I've been using is like, we can't spiritually bypass the money is here. It's like, oh, I'm going to pretend that it doesn't exist on a mountaintop. I know so many people who did that, by the way. And then they come back like 6 months later and they're like, I'm broke and I need money,
Exactly. Yeah.
Like I would love to just run away and live off the land on a mountaintop. But even in the indigenous communities, this is another one I've talked about where I'm like, let's not bypass the reality. The indigenous communities I've been in, like they have ripped us off. They've stolen. They've scammed us out of money. I mean, they're good people too. A lot of them
Absolutely,
are great people.
But money is
they need
stronger
money
than all of us. Absolutely. Yeah. We need money to survive. I remember being in Peru to do my study, and one of the shamans in the center I was at was one day on his motorcycle just doing like circles. And I was like, what is happening? They're like, well, he just bought a new bike and he's showing it off. And I was like, oh, how interesting. And there was arguments around money all the time. Mm-hmm. How much do you charge? He's not getting paid enough. It's like, that's what I mean by, it brings me back to plants versus psychedelics. Money is the energy of money. That's the entity that's money is, the archetype that money is so powerful. And I love that you said that. It's so easy to spiritually bypass, especially in the psychedelic world, where it's like, practicing detachment and transcendence. And it's like, okay, yeah, but you still have to, you will still need to pay for the food that you eat. You will still need to like provide, even if you want to have children or a family, that's a whole other set of expenses. And it brings me back to like, how do we educate? How do we untaboo the taboo? I just wrote a post about money and psychedelics for the Integration Circle. And I called it, how do you untaboo the taboo? Like, how do you really start talking about, I mean, you've been doing it, but how do we make it as normal of a conversation that actually the next MAPS conference or any conference, there's at least 3 segments on navigating your money complex, or like dealing with money in psychedelics, or what is right reciprocity, or we know this. And we talked about it in that summit. When there were villages, you brought chickens to your shaman. You brought seeds. You brought them something, gold, shoe, I don't know, whatever. It's always been there. Yeah. But it's how do we not? I love what you said. It's really that scorpionic edge: sex, money, death.
Yeah. Psychedelics.
Psychedelics, right?
It's
how do
true.
we make that mainstream?
Yeah, no one wants to address it, but it's right in front of us. And like I think there's because I've had, I mean, I can send you screenshots for years. People have been writing me like, oh, plant medicine is free. It's plants. They grow in the ground. It's part of, it's our divine birthright. And I'm like, have you ever made ayahuasca? It's like so much human labor and like takes 7 years to grow one vine. And I'm like, I mean, even, grow mushrooms. I'm like, yeah, even that's like not free. I mean, maybe if you live in the right climate and the right environment, you get gifted some spores and you know what you're doing. I mean, and yeah, there is a certain level of like, all of it is a larger problem. But right now, like the solution to that is we have to go into it. It's like any shadow work. We can't just like hide and pretend that it's not there. But it needs to be discussed. And then, the other part of it is the reciprocity, which I've been saying for years, especially people getting into the space. But let's be honest, the big players, the VCs, the people, the pharmaceuticals, they're the ones where it's like sacred reciprocity needs to be mandatory, built in from day one. Yes. Like there should be no one entering this space. I'm like, me and all the little guys out there, the little facilitator doing one session a week, don't harp on them. I mean, they're just getting by on some level. But, if someone's coming in with billions and trying to patent a molecule and, blah, 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 I'm like, well, why aren't we holding them accountable first and foremost? Not to say.
Why do you think? That's a great question.
Yeah, well. So they're too busy getting patents and, pleasing shareholders or something. I don't know. I mean, I would assume it is, but I don't even know who most of these players are. I just know that they exist. But, that's another thing I would say.
I can tell you, and I imagine you had your own conversations, but 2019, right before the pandemic started, I had lunch with two, one was a CEO and one was a angel investor in a very big company that I will not name. And I met them through a shared friend, and she told them what I do. They're like, oh, let's meet this person, and And I sat there and I listened to their spiel, and we had a lovely conversation. And then I asked them my, $1 million, and I was like, what do you guys do for integration? And these are the responses I got. One of them was like, really, he looked at me like surprised, and he said, well, we actually didn't think about it yet. And they were already providing the service, right? So the substances were being delivered home, and I was like, what do you mean you haven't thought about it? So like, what happens after they take it at home? And I appreciated him because it felt sincere. He was like, you're right. And I'm really troubled by this. And the other person said to me, literally, he's like, I'm not concerned about that now. My concern is scalability.
Are they still in business?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, God.
Yes, they are very much in business. And again, I don't want to make that, we're not shaming, but I think for me, it was a very sobering exposure to a very severe symptom. I'm like, wait, this is really the archetype of money. But I also, and I'm curious, what do you think? I don't think that people who are not actually experiencing what's happening on the ground, from the level of, consultants from the jungle to the coach to the psychologist, should be making these decisions and forming these companies alone.
Yeah.
That for me would be integrative health. I'm like, no, you can't do that. And and again, it brings me back to loss. Like, you will need to lose a few $1 million in this moment for the long-term trajectory of what your company is trying to do in the psychedelic science. And are we willing to do that? Which the answer is no. Oh. At this moment, it's no.
No, then they sell to someone else who has a grand vision. They're going to try to do it better, and we'll see what happens with them. I mean, it's funny. I try not to poke too much fun, and I'm very much a believer in like, okay, share my voice, educate as much as possible. And on some level, it's all going to have to shake itself out anyways. I mean, this is such we're all toddlers trying to figure it out. I mean, I've had I've had clients working in Oregon and opening up the first service center and, the training. And it's like, wow, it's the blind leading the blind. No one knows what they're doing. It's like, we're just kind of making this up as we go and everybody's trying to figure it out. And it might backfire completely and we'll see, it's
sure.
one
And
day
again,
at a
like
time.
we said, yeah, exactly. And there will be, sad to say, but people will get hurt. And it's less about trying to, right, how do we have a harm reduction approach and how do we bring psychedelic integrity, what we experience with the plants, what we experience with the psychedelics, how do we bring that consciousness to anything and everything? If we really want to try and create change on a collective level and not keep doing the same thing over and over again.
Day-to-day integration and integrity. I mean, it's all one, right? It's like, how are you living every moment? Not just your psychedelic business or your psychedelic journeys, but like you said, like be willing to go in. And, I always say to my clients, just, be able to stop and take a look at your ego and ask yourself, like, am I capable of this? Is this aligned with my values and my integrity? I mean, I've actually given money back to people that don't align with what I believe in or my own value system, where I'm like, you know what? I can't help you, because I have my own boundaries. And I encourage everybody to make those decisions. It's
absolutely.
Like, that's all you can do is like, be aligned with whatever you believe in. And hopefully it's, for a greater vision than just you making money and thinking I always say people think it's just like an easy business to hold space once a week and charge $5,000. Like,
no.
Yeah. Good luck with that.
If you sit there and you're on your phone the whole time, and it's maybe then.
I always tell people, I'm like, it's actually really boring. Like, don't do it. I'm like, I would hate to be a psychedelic therapist. I find it to be, because I think there's a lot of glorification. It's like, oh, these medicines, this is great. But, oh my God, it's hard work. It's a lot of work, It's not glamorous like everybody thinks. So
it's a lot of work. It's a lot of sacrifice.
No.
It's a lot of devotion.
Yeah.
If you really do it, if you're offering a really knowledgeable, mindful, intentional, accountable space, it takes a lot of commitment, a lot of devotion, a lot of unlearning, right? A lot of going and learning new things. It takes a lot.
Yeah. Devotion to your own integration as well. Huge. Well, Ido, I want to leave you an opportunity to share, what do you have coming up this year? Anything we should be on the lookout for? And, how do people join your integration circle? What's the
so the best way for right now is look up our Instagram or our website, the Integration Circle. Our next close offering starts at the end of May, and it's going to be a course about reclaiming love through psychedelics. So how do you reconnect with the experience of self-love in couplehoods, after sexual trauma, and the divine love when you have that experience on psychedelics, and how do you work with it to really create a deeper connection? I'm very passionate about that topic at the moment. So hosting a bunch of amazing people who are going to come and talk about different topics all related to this. So that starts in the end of May. And my next thing, I'm just going to name it. Is that I will be hosting a 2-day summit in the Bay Area in September. Ooh. Yes, that's going to be, it's going to be a lot of fun. So
are you putting it on?
Come in person. Yes. So hopefully you can come. We'd love to see you. We can talk about that, and
great.
Hoping to release it to the world in the next month. So we'll see.
Amazing. Please let me know. Happy to share it around,
Thank you so much.
Get it filled with good people.
That's the hope.
Thank you so much for being here. Oh, I appreciate this. We'll have to have you back and go deeper into some ayahuasca archetypes that come up.
Yes, I would love that.
Thank you.
All right.
I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you're feeling inspired, I'd appreciate it if you showed your love with a review. And check out my YouTube channel where you can find the video version of this podcast. You can also head to BethAWeinstein.com to learn more about me and grab my free business growth trainings. Remember, you carry your own unique medicine, and your medicine is what we need for these times.